Paisan, come join us for weekly cigar talk.
This job is not for everyone. It's all fun and games and jokes on social media. But this shit is dangerous.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Exciting day, kind of just running through the where we are with the Cuba thing, right? The Cuba thing. As a cigar guy, and on this channel, we talk a lot of the effects that are going to be coming with this big change with Cuba. And I've mentioned it a few times. But where is the change? What is the change? What do we look like? What's happening? Today, I'm going to go over some of that. Today, we're going to talk about what does it mean? Where are we at? What is the U.S. asking? What is Cuba saying? What does Cuba not want to do? What does the U.S. want to do? This is based on March 24th, 2026, today, and we're going to dive right into that. So the demands, we'll start there, right? The ongoing demands from the U.S. Biggest thing that is getting hung up is the demand by the U.S. for leadership change. You know, Trump administration, they basically told Cuba that President Miguel Diaz-Canel must step down. He's got to step down from power. So that means he's got 2 years left in his presidential term. He's communist. You know, he is the head of the Communist Party. So let me say that again. President Miguel Diaz-Canel, they're saying he's got to step down from power. They're saying, even though he's got 2 years left in his presidential term and 5 years he's been the head of the Communist Party for 5 years now, for any meaningful deal to happen, for any of this to move forward, he's got to get off. He's got to get off ramped. He's got to be basically torn out of the deal. That the U.S. is pushing will lead to the U.S. economic relief. That's going to give them, you know, that's the U.S.'s playing cards, right? So that economic relief that Cuba desperately needs is only coming with the exit of President Miguel Diaz-Canel. So let's start there. So once again, thanks for coming to the channel. Thanks for having this conversation with me, and thank you again for liking and subscribing my previous videos. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. It's going to help this channel. It's going to help, obviously, me getting you more cigar content. But let's dive into this Cuba. So as I mentioned, the regime change, right? That's going to be the biggest thing that the U.S. is pushing for. So they want that political shift. They're not demanding the full dismantlement of the Communist Party or the government structure. The U.S. is pushing for what they're calling dramatic changes to Cuba's socialist economic model. Okay, what does that mean? What it means is they want greater private sector autonomy. They want measures that would weaken state control. In other words, opening up the ports, energy, tourism, and those key industries to allow U.S. investment, including from Cuba, Cuban Americans that had previously fled Cuba. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he's the one that's been kind of pushing, and in there he said to Cuba, he stated Cuba will have to get new people in charge to fix its economy. So it's not a threat, but it is what they're looking for, that political shift. So the economic consensus tied to the sanctions relief. So this is, what do you get? You know, we know, Cuba knows that they're hurting. They've been hurting for a long time. What is it now that is going to be gained by giving in to the U.S.? It's the economic concessions that are tied into the sanctions relief, right? So in exchange for gradually easing the embargo and the oil blockade, mind you, these blackouts are getting longer and longer, the U.S. seeks Cuban commitments to market-oriented reforms on a month-to-month basis. Restitution or compensation for property seized after that 1959 revolution. And the reduced reliance on countries like Russia, China, or even Venezuela. President Trump has repeatedly described this as very easily made deal or a friendly takeover. Now let's go back to the difficult part of this, and I mentioned this in the more cigar oriented, because that's kind of what we care about, right? Not only, but a big part of that is what happens with these cigar companies that were nationalized by Cuba. The restitution or compensation for not just those tobacco fields and those companies, but properties, all of that's going to have to happen. And if it doesn't happen, then I don't think there's a deal. I think that's a very, very big part of this demand. All right, so now we know what the U.S. wants, right? U.S., to say it plainly, they want a new regime. They really want to have them to stop relying on their adversaries like China and Russia. And they really they don't want to dismantle that Communist Party, but they don't want them to be in charge. Which, okay, I get that, especially with it being so close to where we live here in Florida. What's Cuba holding up? Why is this not happening, right? I mean, here we are, the 24th. Some of us were hoping it would have been done by now. Cuba's refusing. What's the holdup? The political system and the leadership, they're not really negotiable. Cuba has rejected discussions of its one-party political system. They're basically saying the structure of its government, President Diaz-Canel's term or position, is, their internal matter. It's not subject to a negotiation. And regime change is absolutely off the table. So if I just said that regime change is absolutely off the table, and the major thing that we're looking for is a regime change, mind you, we already said 2 years left in his make-believe presidency or whatever you want with the Communist Party over there. What happens? Well, nothing. Nothing happens. That's the answer. Nothing, right? We're at a standstill. That's got to be dealt with. The other thing they have issue is their sovereignty, their self-determination first. Havana insists that they must respect, the U.S. must respect its independence and its political model with no preconditions. They're open to dialogue on bilateral differences, especially the trade and the oil blockades and humanitarian impact, but they will not accept U.S. dictation over who leads their country or how its economy is restructured beyond what they already deem necessary, right? Cuba's also had limited economic gestures only. So Cuba's announced steps like allowing Cubans living abroad to invest in private businesses and partner with state firms, but U.S. officials, especially Mr. Rubio, or including Mr. Rubio, Marco Rubio, have dismissed these as not dramatic enough, and they're insufficient. All of this is insufficient to the U.S. without leadership change. So where are we? We're at an impasse right now. The publicly confirmed talks, from Cuba back on March 13th, and obviously the talks are still active, but as of the 13th, they're deadlocked precisely because the U.S. is conditioning real sanctions relief and Diaz-Canel's exit. That is the biggest thing. Any deeper reforms really don't matter, or not matter. The deal breaker is that regime change. So while Cuba is using the economic pain of the blockades to negotiate with trade and commercial deals, but they're drawing a hard line. Their hard line is being drawn against any perceived interface in its sovereignty or its leadership. So right now, no breakthroughs occurred. Both sides continue to have high level of contacts amid the island's deepening blackouts and shortages, and it's only going to get worse. When I mean it's going to get worse, it's going to get worse for the Cuban people. They're the ones that are now suffering. They're the ones that are, for lack of a better way to put it, they're the pawns in this chess game. They're the ones that are being really used as tools on both sides. The U.S. is going to continue to tighten the noose, telling allies and anybody else, don't trade with Cuba. Don't do it. This is going to have to force them to see the damage that they're causing their people, to see the hardship. And the only escape from the hardship is through dictatorship, through the change of their dictatorship or that socialist party, that socialist communist dictator, basically completely change the way that they've governed themselves for the last 60 years. So, do I think it's going to happen? I do. I think it's going to take pressure from the people. I think that eventually they're not going to be able to turn the lights on anymore. You really put this island at a point of no return. Obviously, Venezuela's off the table for helping. Russia and China aren't running to aid, and it's becoming close to what would be considered a humanitarian effort here. And boy, that sounds crazy, right? And I'm not trying to get clouded on this. I'm trying to stay positive and light, and there is positive in this. With the regime change comes the economic relief. With the economic relief, the floodgates open quicker than I would say most Cuban nationalists will expect, because people are dying to get over there. People are dying to get in there, and I mean people, U.S. investors, obviously the cigar industry, but other industries. Obviously, there's so many. I mean, farmers. There's so much from tourism. From obviously the agricultural. Then you've got the industries like the rum and different things that they're going to jump quickly. I mean, very quickly. Hotels, real estate, buildings that have been untouched will start getting scooped up. Those remodels will begin. And then, within 2 years of that time, those renovations, that money that's pumped in there, you're going to see Cuba really shine and be probably the gem of the Caribbean. I mean, it's gonna outshine every location, like it did before. It was the Vegas before Vegas was Vegas. But anyway, that's where we are today. Today, we're no closer, unfortunately, to seeing this Cuban liberation. The Cuban people get what they deserve, which is their country. Okay, so let's talk about the likely trajectory, right? So in the short term, next weeks, months, we can expect to continue back and forth on smaller issues. I think they're going to probably start discussing more counter narcotics, limited humanitarian economic gestures. Cuba may offer up some more goodwill measures and some additional prisoner releases, that type of a thing. I said the U.S. I think will maintain and pressure mainly by that oil blockade and the sanctions. I don't think that's coming. They're going to loosen that up at any time. We talked about the sticking points. We know that for the U.S., the leadership change is a big thing. Cuba's continued refusal, it creates kind of an impasse. But I think there's got to be something there. There's got to be a deal for a full sanctions lift. Maybe they will, bend on that leadership change. The possible breakthroughs, limited economic openings, sanctions easing up. If Cuba, and only if Cuba, goes to a more market-oriented reform, as Rubio's described. Let's remember, Marco Rubio's, he's incredible. First off, a Florida guy, obviously. I love Marco Rubio. I think he does a great job. Wherever your politics lie, if you can kind of just get your head out of your party's, say it in a nice way, get your head out of your party's agenda, you'll see that Rubio comes from probably the best position to be able to negotiate this, being a Cuban American himself, having lived through a lot of this. And this isn't something that is a talking point that he's researched. He's lived through this. External factors, Vatican's been in there. We haven't talked about it, but on a quiet stage, the Vatican has taken a role to continue to mediate. Hopefully, they'll continue that. I said, I think overall, Trump's pressure, that maximum pressure approach, sanctions, direct engagement, is going to force the economic and potential shift that Cuba needs. And that progress really depends on Cuba really bending to that release of leadership, that becoming a more democratic state. So that's kind of where we are. Things are fast moving. I'm going to keep posting, and hopefully you're going to subscribe so you'll hear more of these dramatic and really historic events that are taking place, with what I call that great liberation of Cuba, that final liberation. Again, I root for the Cuban people. I root for democracy. Are the U.S. playing hardball? They are, but they have to. How else do you deal with a regime that says, we'll allow people to invest outside of our country, but don't tell us how to, I get it. But what they've been doing is failed their people for 60 plus years. And here we are today looking at what could be incredible. And the people that had to flee, a lot of them are still here. And a lot of them will get to go back. And yes, I think the reparations and it's important. The rightful heirs to some of these, we talk Cuban cigars, the rightful heirs to these names that we've known for forever that were just stolen. They were just tapped on and said, nope, we're going to take this under the national umbrella of Cuba. We now run it. Nationalizing people's property, nationalizing their products. That's not okay. It's the 24th of March. That's where we are today. Pretty much at a deadlock. Negotiations are ongoing. They are. The communication, I shouldn't say negotiations. Communications are ongoing. Nobody's walking away from a table. But the hard line's been drawn by the current government in Cuba and our government here in the United States. See you at the next one. Please like and subscribe if you want to follow and you enjoy these updates. If you like cigar content, I got plenty of that. Go through some of the older videos. I'm going to try and pump a video out a week at least. And look forward to talking to you guys at the next one. Thanks.
This job is not for everyone. It's all fun and games and jokes on social media. But this shit is dangerous.